Hello, everybody. We're going to get started. Yes. Thank you all for coming. I'm Glenn Shrum, director of the MFA Lighting Design program here at Parsons, and we're really excited about a two-part program today. First, we have a lecture, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a bit, and then there'll be a reception that will take place in the same room. And you'll see that this room will be transformed during the course of the event. We're also going to take an intermission, a bit of a break in between those two, so that we can move the chairs. And at that time, we're going to I'll invite you to view some other student installations in the building. So before we get started, I have a few thank yous that I wanted to do. First, I wanted to thank the group that helped to organize this exhibition, Bethany Camerati in particular, and the School of Constructed Environments office has been hugely instrumental. Our Dean, Robert Kirkbride, has been a big supporter of the lighting design program in this event. And the students of the Light-Space Art elective class, they're responsible for this installation that you see, and there'll be more information about that. There they are. And Emrah, could you advance, please? So I also wanted to thank and announce a new program that we have, the Parsons Lighting Design Partners Program. So a year ago, in celebration of the 30-year anniversary of Parsons Master's Program, we decided to create a new system, a new way to recognize and bring industry partners and design firms closer to our program and involve them in the decisions that we're making, and also really offer an opportunity for them to more closely impact and more significantly impact the student learning experience in our curriculum. So a year later, we have our first set of partners, our charter partners, and I wanted to recognize each of them individually. We have two different partner types. We have design partners, which are design firms. While I'm introducing the partners, I also wanted to introduce the representatives that are here with us today. So our design partners, Available Light, we have John Delfino here. Thank you. From Focus Lighting, we have Christine Hope. I think she's around somewhere. HLB Lighting, Lee Brandt is with us today. And Illumination Arts, Ken Douglas is here. And our industry partners, the first has been involved with us for a little bit longer than the others, the Designers Lighting Forum of New York, and they're represented today by Francesca Bastianini. Eaton Lighting and Phil Acconi is here with us. Velux Skylights and Bill Charlton is here. And XAL, is Lisa here? Great, Lisa Hauser. So this Partners Program has already significantly impacted our student experience. The financial support that we got is making this program possible. Things like supporting the materials for these student installations, both in this room and that you'll see elsewhere. Bringing in guests, outside guests. These are very important ways that we are helping to make the experience as Parsons students as strong as possible. And I wanted to also mention that we're planning our Pro Tango event, which many of you are aware of, which will be supported by this group as well. And to put on your calendar, the tentative date for Pro Tango is Wednesday, March 8th, 2017. So that's an annual event. It's something that's a lot of fun and is a reunion of sorts and an opportunity for us to get together again. And let me see. Actually, before I move on from the Partners Program, I wanted to recognize Jesse Flores from the New School University's development group. Jesse has been instrumental in making this work. So, thank you. Okay, let me see. Oh, and I have one last announcement. We're really excited that in the 30-year history of Parsons Lighting Design Program, for the first time, we are going to have a staff position in our Light and Energy Lab. This is a brand new announcement. We're going to have a part-time staff position. This is just being introduced. It'll be a person that'll be able to help to organize and manage the lab, but also really expand the way that we're using it as a teaching tool. So I wanted to announce that to this group and encourage everybody to spread the word about this opportunity. We'd love to get a person that is interested in working with students and really supporting the program. Also, we anticipate this role including opportunities to teach both in the lab but also beyond the lab. So help spread the word about that exciting opportunity. We want to get the right person, and we think it's going to be a really significant step forward in the lighting design program. Let me see. The next thing, could you do the next slide, Emrah? Great. So I'm going to introduce Derek Porter, Associate Professor of Lighting Design and faculty of the Light-Space Art elective, to tell you a little bit more about the installation.
Thank you. So you all will obviously be able to find me this evening with my jacket. And this is by design. You will see soon with this installation why I have on an orange jacket. First and foremost, it's really, really such a delight to have you all here. It's always lovely to bring in alumni, students from across Parsons, and other colleagues and friends in the lighting world into our home and to share with you what we do. So thank you all for coming. I do want to recognize the students. They have worked tirelessly in this class for the culmination of this installation. So can you all just briefly stand up? I think you're all kind of consolidated here. So congratulations. Okay, you can sit down now. The students in this class represent a really interesting cross-section across Parsons at large and certainly the School of Constructed Environments. They represent students in the MFA Lighting Design program, but also the dual degree in Architecture and Lighting and the MFA double major between Interior Design and Lighting, and then Design and Technology, which is in the School of Art and Art, Media, and Technology. So this is really an interesting cross-sampling and really an example of our coursework at Parsons, where we very much enjoy mixing disciplines and crossing boundaries, if not destroying boundaries specifically. So the Light-Space Art class, just in brief, is an interesting complement to the lighting design program. So we leave behind calculations, foot candles, lumens, LEDs, photometrics and so on, and simply study the phenomenon of light as we see it, as we perceive it, as we understand space. All of this is done through analog processes. So we build things, we look at materials, we look at light in relationship to that, and then how one sees and perceives and responds to those situations. We look not just only at vision, but on a multisensorial level, including how the body moves through space and the kinesthetic process of the body understanding the environment in which it occupies. Also, we're looking at time-based relationships, psychology, memory, and so on. And then also looking at the light and space art movement and other artists that are experimenting with light more broadly. We think it's really important for the students to examine other cognate disciplines in order to understand more clearly and more precisely their own discipline, and also to think expansively about what lighting design can do as a profession. So this installation specifically came about through a series of exercises that the students did. We start the semester with a series of individual exercises that look at, again, phenomenon, material relationships, and then we have a series of coalescing of ideas that then take 17 students and reduce it down to 6, and then 3, and then to 1 project ultimately, or at least one idea. There's no one project that's chosen, but yet, or rather I should say, a series of ideas that are reduced to a single notion. And then we work for the remainder of the semester, up to this point at least, to then define that problem more carefully. And there are several factors that influence what this ends up being. Certainly, first and foremost, we're interested in the perceptual aspects of how the individual, the occupant of space, responds to the piece. So there's a phenomenal component to that. But also, in order to see, or I should say to perceive, an instrument like this, You have to consider what the elements are themselves. What are the material relationships? How does it literally frame the experience specifically? How do you situate a material in relationship to how one's sensory response is going to take place? And then the relationship, and especially for the case of this piece, the relationship of the instrument to the space. So we knew we were going to be in this space. We knew the intrinsic properties of this space, so then the instrument needed to be of the space. But also, as you can see, it's in direct conflict with the space. All of this is by design and through our intention. So the instrument, as I said, is of the space, but it also, and it's a thing, but it also is empty to some degree, and you'll get a better sense of this. It is reactive. It's actually activated by your response. So you become a part of the piece. Your presence is a part of what you will see as the evening and afternoon proceeds. Did we say that we have food and drinks too? So it's going to be a fun time. So I'll leave it at that, and then you can determine and discern through the course of the afternoon and evening your thoughts with this. I certainly invite and welcome conversation. Again, thank you for being here. I'm going to turn this back over to Glenn.
Thank you, Derek. So I'm going to move through the instrument. So our speaker today is Emrah Baki Ulas. Emrah is joining us from London. Most recently, he was in Sydney until just before then. Emrah is a good friend of mine. He's the lighting group leader at Steensen Varming, and also started a lighting program in Sydney, a one-year master's program in Sydney. He's Turkish originally, but also went to school at Wismar in Germany. So he comes from many different places, many different kinds of light. This talk today in particular, we're really excited because as the kinds of ideas, the kinds of ways of thinking about light, new ways of thinking about light that Derek mentioned that we're interested in and that this installation takes on is really the backdrop of this talk. So I'm looking forward to a provocative night of conversation, and welcome, Emrah.
Thank you. Thank you, Glenn. Everyone can hear me fine? This? Great. It's a delight to be here with you this evening, and thanks again, Glenn and Derek, for inviting me. Thanks for trusting me with the guest lecture, so I'll try to do my best. Also, I have never in my life presented in an actual immersive light art installation, so it's the first. This talk that you'll see today is actually based on an earlier talk that I did in Copenhagen. It was titled 19 Short Stories on How Little We Know About Light. So this is a pretty much changed version of it. I kept some stories, I expanded on them, added some other ones, and it's really adjusted so that it's aligned with the theme of tonight, of questioning light. The key and overarching message is that our profession, the profession of lighting design, is a profession of the unknowns. Even the definition of light itself is an unknown. So in that perspective, whatever we do with light, whether we are just solving complex problems of assisting certain tasks with lighting scenarios, or whether we are creating emotions or communicating certain things, light itself is an amazing medium, and it is impossible to not question it in that sense. So the small bits of this talk, it is all divided into smaller bits and fragments. They are mostly intentionally naive, borderline stupid sometimes, sometimes seemingly impossible propositions, and some are just personal experiences of light that I hope you will find will relate to what you do also in your own professional lives. So I really appreciate all of you taking time of your busy evenings, I'm sure. So I do hope you enjoy and have a bit of a laugh, most importantly. So the number one question is, what light isn't? It is a very important question, I think. And the reason is, when you think about it, we people who work with light, like I work with light, and I proudly talk to people about how I use light to change environments and create emotions and so on and so on. But tragically, I don't know what light really is. And tragically, none of us in this room really know what light really is. We do have a definition, of course. We have this definition that says light is the portion of the electromagnetic radiation that is visible to human eye between 380 nanometers and 700 nanometers that lies between the UV and infrared spectrum and so on and so on. But let's look at that in a very different perspective. This is a universally accepted definition, but the question tries to appreciate the ununderstood potential of what is beyond that. Knowledge, philosophically, is not a complete understanding of a thing. It is a reflection of that thing at that very precise time in history. And it is time-bound. It is bound to individuals, it's bound to organizations, it's bound to communities, and so on. So to be holistic, we need to recognize the unseen potential of what light is not. So what this is proposing basically is that we're looking at light as it is now, but the different schools of thought may see or define things differently. And if you see our current definition of light, it's almost like layers of knowledge coming on top of one another and forming where we are now. And who knows what is the next layer in what we know of light. What light isn't, we don't know yet. So let's just look at it in the precise words of someone who questioned what light is or what light was not. This is Einstein. He said imagination is more important than knowledge, because knowledge is limited to all we know and understand, whereas imagination embraces the entire world and all there ever will be to know and understand. So let's just go back a couple of thousand years and look at this in perspective. Let's think we are living in a world where everyone thinks the world is flat, the earth is flat. This is the norm, this is the definition, until sometime later in history, some lunatic comes and suggests that it actually is round, and the definitions suddenly change. Everything basically evolves. And we can see exactly the same thing happening in the history of definition of light itself. Let's look at how the early philosophers thought of light. The early philosophers thought light originated from the human eye. So we basically emitted these rays to reveal things around us. I'm talking about people like Plato and Aristotle and so on. And there were many other philosophers that followed these thoughts for many, many years. Then came Moorish Empire, of course. We see a lot of names: Descartes, Kepler, Snell, who developed notions of optics, and our understanding developed further and further. We see Newton, we see Goethe, and we see Young. And at that point, we know color theory. We understand a lot more about light. And at that point, it's almost impossible to think someone would have suggested that light originated from the eye. But it doesn't stop there. Then we have Faraday, we have Hertz, we have Maxwell coming, contributing to understanding. We understand that it is actually part of electromagnetic spectrum. Then Einstein comes in, throws in quantum theory, and so on and so on. So it is just an evolution. Where we are is just one point in time, and nothing more than that. So our definition as it is of light, while it holds perfectly true for many experimentations and so on we might do, it poses even more difficult questions involving paradigms of time, space, quantum theory. So who knows what is to come? And I'm saying this in a very humble way, in a way. Of course, it is an incredible progress that we've made in definition of light, but the best and most timeless of things are the simple, elegant versions of things. So again, very humbly, I suggest that maybe the definition of light as it is now may not be as simply elegant as it can be in the future. Similarly, if we look at our understanding of color vision, this is how we depict it now. It is quite well simplified. It holds true pretty much every time we test and try it. But again, is it a little bit clunky? Can it be a bit more simplified, or can it be understood in a completely different way and completely different context? We don't know yet. But when we look at nature, we see that nature is complex but not complicated. All works with extreme simplicity and harmony. So one day, maybe our definitions of light and color and vision will also evolve to very different places than where they are now. And I do recognize, of course, a lot of us here are people who actually deal with light in a very practical manner of using it in actual applications. So we're not scientists, but it's important to remember and understand poetry, technicality, and philosophy always go hand in hand. So it is for us to understand and respect to the future of what the definition of light will offer us, and how the way we apply light in our practices may completely transform in that sort of context. Next is, on a slightly lighter note, the color of everything. This is based on and inspired by a memory. At the University of Technology, Sydney, one day in one of my classes, we were going through the fluorescent tube technology, how in a fluorescent tube the phosphor coating basically transforms the electrical energy that follows from one end of the tube to the other end, and basically it is the phosphor coating that creates the visible white light. And I concluded saying, well, if there wasn't that phosphorus coating, there would be a very dim, deep purple light that we would hardly see in the actual tube itself. And at that moment, one of the students had a wonderful revelation to himself, and in a lot of seriousness, he made this amazing comment. He said, "So that must be the color of electricity." And that made me think, does everything have color? Can we give color to every single thing that we can think of, whether they are tangible, whether they have surfaces or not? Something to just think about. And talking of color, let's talk about how light tastes. How does light taste? Talking of color is always fun because I think it has almost a culinary aspect to it. It is quite firmly, one can argue, the taste of light. You can taste light in colors. It's a very simple fact, but we often tend to forget. We tend to define light in colors. We say red light, green light, blue light, whatever. Of course, color only happens in our brains, in our perceptual systems, when we basically get the data from the external world, if you like. So colors are not wavelengths, but they are actually our perceptions or our reflections of them under certain conditions, and they may change, not only because of the actual external conditions, but also internal conditions as well. Exactly like how we react to food. Sugar or sweet is not sugar. Sweet is how we perceive sugar. Bitter, salty, or sour do not exist outside our taste buds and outside our perceptive systems. So when one considers the parallels of all the different senses we have and the sense of seeing, you see the wonderful parallels between. So often you see the parallels between light and sound talked about, But if you look at light and taste, again, there are incredible parallels. Both have channels of processing external stimuli in a very similar manner. Both have saturation points. Both have contrast. Both have after imaging or aftertaste. Both get weaker as you get exposed to the certain taste or certain light for a long amount of time. So one of the reasons of aftertaste, of course, or after image. Both have glare, contrast, excessive contrast causing glare. Both just exist in our minds, basically, and nowhere else. And both are very phenomenal. So they both have limited range of perceptibility. We can see certain colors or we cannot see certain colors. Same with taste. And they interact with one another, so you can actually stimulate one sense using the other. So yeah, quite firmly, you can suggest color is the taste of light. And I came across this wonderful depiction in a very simple manner, just as we describe red, green, blue color vision in a way that you see green and red as complementary colors, blue and yellow, and brightness in the earlier diagram that we looked at, that most of you will be aware. Similarly, in taste, you have sweetness, sourness, saltiness, and bitterness. You can basically define, just as you define colors, you can define taste, which is quite interesting, right? So, which makes us move to brown. Is brown an illusion? What do you think? Of course it is an illusion, because every single color is an illusion anyway. But brown is somewhat different and a bit more special. It is the color of the earth. It is the most abundant color outside oceans. It is the most abundant color in our planet. And it is, quite interestingly, the least loved of all colors. Maybe in a very poetic way, you can think, whatever is in front of you, you never see the beauty of it. It's just, it doesn't appear to be beautiful. So maybe it's something like that because it's in so much abundance. So according to a survey, brown was the least favorite color. It was the favorite color of only 1% of respondents, and it was the least favorite color of 20% of people. But let's look at where brown is. You look at subtractive additive color mixture, you mix red, green, and blue, you don't see brown. You look at subtractive color mixture, it's not there. It's not anywhere in the mainstream color theory. Then you look at how we define brown. I might move around a little bit so you see a bit of effect of the installation in the meantime. So we see brown as darker shades of yellow, red, green, orange, or magenta. Brown is orange and blue mixed. Brown is mixture of red, yellow, or black. These are all different sources quoting what brown is in different ways. Brown is mixture of red and green. Brown is mixture of red, yellow, and blue. Brown is red and black mixed together, and so on, and so on, and so on. So it just goes, the definition of brown. That is all good. Okay, fine. What about brown light? So, because all those definitions are based on pigment mixtures. So, what do we need to do with light so we get brown light? Is there something such as brown light? We look at the spectrum. We can't see anything that resembles brown, really. But when you actually study it, you find that almost, not everywhere in the spectrum, but a big portion of the spectrum, when it's in dim conditions, it is perceived to be brown. So it is a big question that the color of the earth is so strange, and we still don't quite understand something about it that is missing in our understanding of color. So, next question is, I think if there are any street lighting manufacturers here, they will have to excuse me, but I have a proposition. Can we scrap street lighting? What do you think? Yes. Then we need to do something about it, of course. So this was this came up from somewhere completely different, as is often the case with lots of things. This is an installation we did in Sydney. It was for a light festival, Vivid Sydney Light Festival. It basically is dedicated to the beauty of nature, a HD, highly detailed projection, a giant projection of the moon with an eclipse effect that is superposed onto it. So it is, of course, something that you wouldn't really see in the nature, but it also looks natural in a sense, and it is supposed to celebrate nature. Just as a side note, this picture, which became also the flagship image for this event, is actually a total coincidence. We didn't hire this guy, we didn't pay him anything. He just happened to show up there with his cape and with his hat, and I was fast enough to take my mobile out and just catch the moment. So it's not a professional photo or anything like that. But anyway, let's come back. So just celebrating nature. Of course, we talk about celebrating nature every time we talk about dark sky and so on. So let's think of street lighting. Street lighting is probably the biggest single contributor of light pollution. Are we all in agreement? Yeah? Yes, I hope so. Otherwise the rest of the story won't make sense. But anyway, so let's assume you agree that street lighting is the biggest contributor of light pollution. Well, it is, of course. But anyway, let's think of the amount of effort that goes into that. Cabling, all the rare metals, all the metals that are becoming, that we are running out of, including copper and zinc and so on. Transportation, the trees we cut in some countries to create these light poles, metals, processing, fabrication, I don't know, you name it. Digging the grounds, cabling underneath, conduitry, PVC, transportation, building huge machines to be able to put these things up. Electricity, of course. Powder coating, anodizing, galvanizing, and so on and so on. So, can we do this in a smarter way? I wonder. Maybe one day we can imagine a time that we limit the exterior use of lighting to only to beautify things and to make monuments or buildings or spaces look special in a way, not necessarily for utilitarian purposes. So can we address the utilitarian purpose in a different manner? Maybe one day we can. The solution maybe is to go to the root cause. So the root cause is that we cannot see in darkness. So how can we tackle that? We're not talking about gimmicky gadgets in sci-fi movies or military grade equipment that allows us to see at night necessarily, that we all wear these things. That will be a little bit troublesome. And maybe there are other ways. What could be those other ways? What could be the ways that may eventually happen and basically leave some of us who do street lighting, if you're doing any street lighting, out of your jobs? It is perhaps the answer is perhaps in molecular biology. If you look at the very common debates that are going on about surgery versus biotechnology, a lot of the forefront scientists believe that surgery is basically archaic and it's over, that biotechnology, that making of new organs will actually be the new way that the medicine will move into. So maybe there will be times that we will have new eyes, or we will have different perceptive systems. We will enhance the ability of our ganglion cells or whatever to be able to respond to light in different ways and to be able to allow us to see in darkness, because it is already happening. We already produce tissues, we already make organs in lab conditions, so one day it isn't that difficult to see to the times in some years that we may have what other mammals have in the sense of the ability to see in darkness. So a lot of the nighttime applications of lighting can suddenly disappear in that sense. Part 2. Can we scrap street lighting in a very, very different way? Okay, this is a little bit more far-fetched, but literally far-fetched. So think of using the sun to light up our cities at nighttime. We have thousands of satellites up in the sky. They have the perfect technology to harvest sunlight, to follow sunlight, to react to where the sun is, follow it, and we're coming up with amazing optical technologies. We're making nano-optical devices so we can actually very, very precisely just send light rays to where they need to be. So maybe, again, talking about very utilitarian applications of lighting, maybe one day we can easily capture sunlight and send it to certain parts of the Earth. And of course, depending on meteorological conditions and so on, it could be a useful technology. It will be a very costly technology, but again, put it into context of how much it costs to have all the infrastructure as we have now. And as you think that you come with this idea, you find out, little you know, this was actually tested and tried before. This was an actual experiment that happened in 1992. Some of you may remember. This was Russian space agency. This is after Cold War era. But they basically set up 20-meter large reflectors up in the sky, and they actually tested this idea. Primary reason was to create enough light in Siberia during long winter months to be able to light up large areas that do not receive sunlight, and to be able to increase activity in those regions, or that was at least the agenda that was put forward. But what they could create in 1992, again, just go back many years, they were able to create the sensation of one full moon brightness for a few seconds. It was a very short experiment. But then they created the second version of this experiment, where they were testing a 70-meter, roughly, I don't know what it is in feet. Someone can convert it for me, please. Anyway, 70-meter large mirror, and they were planning to this time create 10 full moons of brightness in an area of around 7 kilometers that was to sweep across Europe and partly Northern America as well, I think, as part of the experiment. But it failed, and they ran out of money, and it all got scanned. But that was more than 20 years ago, right? We have very different technologies now, so it isn't that impossible when you think about it. So it was simple. It was basically, looking at aligning the mirror according to the sun and so on. We all know Snell's reflection theory and so on. All right, so one day it might be different how we light up our streets. A question: how can one compare a candle and an LED using 2nd century BC technology? Any ideas, anyone? I was in Eindhoven many years ago when I was a lighting student in Wismar. They took us to a field trip, and we went to Lichtkunst Museum. That they had lots of setups, the very old setups where they used to make Philips lamps and so on. And they had a very strange setup of a long desk with a paper with a drop of oil on it, which was installed right in the middle on a setup that could move back and forth. And that was how they compared the brightness of the very first light bulbs against candles. Because there's something extremely special about a drop of oil on a piece of paper. Does anyone have an idea what that might be? A drop of oil on a piece of paper looks lighter if you look at it from the darker side, and it looks darker if you look at it from the lighter side. Did I repeat the same thing, or did I say the opposite thing? It looks lighter if you look at it from the darker side, and it looks darker if you look at it from the lighter side. So if everyone can look at it, you see that it looks lighter when you look at it from the darker side because there's more light around there. And when you look at it now, it looks darker. Perfect setup to basically compare two omnidirectional sources. And when you find the exact location, the distance between one source and the other, that gives you the exact proportion between the light that is emitted by those two sources. So 2nd century BC technology comparing an LED and a candle that could be used today if we run out of every other thing in the world. Okay, how slow is light? We think we know light travels at roughly 300,000 kilometers a second. Well, it depends actually. Let's look at the geeky fact of light traveling from the sun to the earth in roughly 8 minutes because it travels so fast. When we look at that journey, it's quite interesting. In vacuum, in space, light obviously travels at that constant speed, and it slows down as it comes into contact with the atmosphere. It slows down just a fraction of the speed it travels. Maybe it slows down by, I think, 1% or maybe, a couple of percents. So, when you think of that, the speed of light actually is a changing thing. It does change depending on the medium that it is traveling in. And of course, when you look at a diamond, for instance, which is one of the materials that slows it down most, and that is one reason why it creates that sparkle, because of course, when you look at the refractions that would happen when the light slows down, you get a lot more dispersion of the different wavelengths, especially if it's coming in contact with the material at an angle. So that's all good. The speed of light is variant. Let's meet Bob Shaw, an Irish writer. In his 1966 book, The Light of the Other Days, he talks about a material called slow glass. This is a fictional material. And this is, in his words, when I say the glass is 10 years thick, it means it takes light 10 years to pass through it. In effect, each one of those panes is 10 light years thick, more than twice the distance to the nearest star. A new piece was always jet black because nothing had come through it yet. Imagine a material like this being available to us lighting designers. Something that you can specify. You can specify the light transmission of the glass in a way that it will actually show the past to the owners of buildings, to the occupiers of buildings. So I can install the glass today. For the first 10 years, you won't see anything. On the 10th year, when you come and look outside, you see the life 10 years ago. So basically, the glass will be playing the life 10 years ago continuously as the time passes. It could be quite interesting. Well, have you heard of slow light? Turns out Danes did it, actually. They slowed light down. In 1999, Danish physicist Lene Vestergaard Hav led a team which succeeded in slowing a beam of light to about 17 meters a second. They later succeeded in stopping light completely and developed methods by which it can be stopped and later restarted. And this was in an effort to develop computers that will use only a fraction of the energy of today's machines. So it is an experiment primarily based on communications technology, so to be able to increase the data transfer, and I suppose in fiber optic cables or so. So imagine if we could put this into practice, if this technology could be available one day. How interesting would that be? It could incredibly transform how we make luminaires, how we make glazing, and so on. How does a shadow appear on a mirror? Or let me ask the simplest of questions. Does shadow appear on a mirror? Can you actually see shadow on a mirror? Who says yes? Who says no? The others must say sometimes. Or depends on the mirror. Okay, let's look at shadow. What is a shadow? Well, shadow could be form shadow or cast shadow. I'm not gonna necessarily lecture anyone on what shadow is, but yeah, basically there are two types of shadow we are talking about here. But what is primarily interesting here is cast shadow, right? The shadow that an object casts onto another surface. So let's think that our surface is a perfectly polished, amazingly polished mirror, and we are casting shadow onto that mirror. What happens? What do you see on the mirror? You cannot see shadow on a mirror. There is no way, if it's a 100% mirror, the shadow will not appear on a mirror. So for a shadow to occur, to come to existence, the surface has to be a diffusing surface, to some degree at least. Doesn't have to be perfectly diffusing, but you need a degree of diffusion to be able to sense shadow on a surface, something to think about, and something that has a lot of practical uses in how we use light, particularly if you're designing things like pelmet lights and light coves and all that with reflective surfaces and so on. Then comes the question, the puzzling question of reflectivity. Okay, this time some answers, because this is a really, really simple question. It's just so that we have a bit of participation happening. So you see two surfaces that primarily occupy these images. You've got a light concrete surface, and then you've got a clear glass surface. Which one of these is more reflective? Who says concrete? Who says glass? Okay, you're trying to buy time. It's a simple question, there's no trick. Who says concrete? Who says glass? Okay. Let's look at it in a different way. Which one of these surfaces is more glossy? The little droplets of mercury versus the rough surface of the timber finish. So let's ask the same question again. Which one of these surfaces is more reflective? The concrete or the glass? Who says concrete? Who says glass? No. Well, no, okay. Clear glass. What is the reflectivity of clear glass? Roughly, just out of 100.
Would it depend on the angle of incidence?
Well, If you buy this glass, if you read the data sheet, it talks about light transmission and light reflection. So roughly clear glass, how much reflection will we get? 5%? 6, 7%? Yeah. What about concrete, light concrete surface? Yeah, let's say 20, 30%, right? I don't know if you said 80 or 18. Yeah, 18, perfect, thank you. So, of course, concrete is more reflective than glass, than the glass in this image. What this question is trying to point at is something that we always get wrong. We mix the sensation of glossiness with reflectivity. We think things that are glossy are also more reflective. In nature, most of the time, that is the case, yes, but it isn't the case necessarily. Things that are reflective are not necessarily, things that are glossy are not necessarily reflective all the time. And if this question was asked maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, this could have been seen as a totally wrong direction, especially by people who design museum gallery lighting and so on. Can discontinuous spectrum lights be the future? This, again, was a question that was first posed in our mind some 6, 7 years ago when LED lights were not in use that much. This was a time when, you may not know, but the light bulb ban first started in Australia in 2009. 2009 onwards, we weren't able to actually buy incandescent standard light bulbs that you still enjoy up to this day, pretty much, right? So we were forced to move to different technologies, and LEDs were definitely not ready at that time. But anyway, so at that time we looked at discontinuous lighting. So I'm sure a lot of you are very much technically savvy and aware of that, but what I mean by discontinuous spectrum lighting, for those who may not have 100% grasp of it, we're talking about continuous spectrum lights such as daylight and tungsten halogens and nowadays LEDs, although they have a bit of an up and down, versus lights such as your phosphor-coated lights, the metal halides and fluorescents and so on. That's all good. So that was the context of the discussion at the time, that those sources were not perfect in rendering the colors in a sensible way. Well, when we did some experiments back in 2010 using identical displays with different continuous and discontinuous spectrum lights, we find, quite interestingly, a lot of people liked discontinuous spectrum lights, the oversaturation of certain colors on a lot of colorful objects. So they were the preferred sources in some way. So this is a very widespreading question, because it also involves a lot of the health and well-being aspects as well. So that's not the direction I'm trying to go necessarily, but let's look at it in the context of having LEDs as sources that we can manipulate to a very, very high degree now and in the very near future. What could be the benefits of having discontinuous spectrum lights? One very obvious, very, very obvious benefit is energy saving. You're basically not sending the light that would be absorbed by a surface to that surface, but you're actually being quite selective as to how you want that surface to appear. And at the same time, you can actually be saving a lot of energy. Yes, of course, already jumping from, say, an incandescent to an LED technology is a huge jump in energy saving sense, as we are today. But we can do a lot better if we actually looked at discontinuous spectrum, selective spectrum, I would call it, in a sensible way that can also enhance our lighting designs. And yes, there could be also applications where we might be giving up a part of the quality if we consider this. So let's say to save some amount of energy, we might look at losing a bit of the color quality of surfaces. But also it's, in a way, time to be realistic. I mean, we wear clothes that cause cancer. We have mobile phones that are killing us, and computers that are harmful to us. Cars are just so. We may as well compromise a bit of the light quality in that context if it will have a lot of wider benefits to the humanity. Anyway, on that slightly controversial or provocative note, let's look at another topic, another question of whether we can apply the methods of preventive conservation to human beings. What I mean by preventive conservation is basically the measures you put into place, especially when you're trying to light cultural material to prevent light-induced fading, to stop photodegradation. So what happens in photodegradation? Basically, light interacts with the molecules of your object, your surface, and then it just decomposes the color composition. So the best way to basically display objects that are prone to light damage would be to keep them in darkness, but that's not the best way to present them, I guess. Otherwise, we'll have to look at them like this. But and yeah, of course, we know that we wouldn't light objects like this in a museum environment because they will get damaged very, very quickly, and we won't be able to protect them. So let's think of a similar thing for living things such as us humans, because light causes some damage to our skins as well. So when we look at an oil painting like this, we say, okay, this oil painting, if I'm going to put it in the world's number one gallery, you'll have to display it under conditions that will have 600 kilolux hours per year. So you'll adjust your light dosage. You'll factor the time, how long you're exposing it to light, and what's the intensity of light, and so on and so on. Let's think of the same thing for ourselves. So if you think how we measure light damage on various different types of objects, we have quite stringent standards. We use ISO blue wool scale to look at light damage, and we classify objects accordingly. And we try to prevent this from happening. Can we look at human skin, and we can maybe, again in a slightly interesting note, classify different types of human skin and different geographical conditions as to how much light people, say, who work in offices or who work outside in trade work and so on, should be exposed to sunlight so that they don't get as much skin damage. So can we have guidelines or government sort of legalization of the amount of light, amount of kilolux hours that should be applied to a human skin, so that we prevent the skin from decaying? And it can really, if we are protecting our master oil paintings, it's something also to consider for our race today and our long-term generations. Next is a technical term again, obscurance, measured in caras. Who has heard of this? Okay. At very early stage in my lighting career, I was extremely fortunate to actually be associated with lighting the exterior shells of the Opera House, working with Jorn Utsen's son. It was very interesting how Jorn Utsen, the architect of the Sydney Opera House, actually approached the problem of, or the very interesting task of lighting the shells of the Sydney Opera House. One of the specific wishes in the architectural brief was to accentuate and maintain the curvature, the appearance of the shells, and to enhance the material qualities to do it justice. And it was quite interesting to solve the problem within the site's location itself, which I'm not going to go into great detail. But one of the very interesting things was that it was intentional that the light effect was to fade out to quite darker shades as you come to the edges of the shells, rather than lighting it in a very flat manner. And also, this is just looking at a different part of the same building. This is the very first time you come into visual contact with the wonderful structural beams of the Sydney Opera House as you walk underneath the concourse. And the darkness of certain parts of this structure is what makes it stand out. Intentional differences in darkness, some very dramatic changes, some very, very soft fades is what actually gives it that three-dimensional form using light. So working on these sort of projects early on, thought of darkness a lot more than I would otherwise do, I guess, and working with the sort of quite influential people like that. So there comes obscurance Cara. I'm not surprised that you haven't heard of this, because I totally made it up. So we have metrics to measure light. We measure light in quite sophisticated ways. We have softwares that measure light, and almost all our standards are about how much light falls onto surfaces and so on. What if we develop a metric to measure darkness? So that obscurance measured in Cara is just a made-up version of that. So if we were to measure darkness, if we had guidelines, international guidelines on darkness, the amount of darkness you're supposed to have in a hotel room or something, I don't know. You can come up with all sorts of different applications of where darkness-related metrics could be very relevant to what we do, of course. But then we can develop quite elaborate, quite detailed definitions of, say, illuminance measured in lux, the amount of light incident on a point or a surface. Obscurance could be the amount of darkness or anti-light incident on a point or a surface measured in caras again. We have light meters. We can have devices that are dark meters. So we can measure and assess required darkness levels for various lighting applications. We can establish industry standards and guidance on maximum or minimum allowable darkness levels for public spaces. We can establish industry standards and guidance on minimum allowable darkness levels for the sky, minimum darkness levels for the sky, and so on. Which brings us to a thought on tailoring light for the weather, something that we can perfectly do at the moment, and it's almost insane to think that we don't. Again, looking at dark sky. We look at dark sky related issues, we look at light pollution related issues. We blame light, of course, because light goes up and causes those reflections. But it's not only light. What is the other element in there? It's the particles in the air, right? That's what causing light pollution. If there would be nothing up there, light just travels into the sky. And if there was like zero humidity, zero particles up in the air, if we were living in an open space, light would just travel. You wouldn't see a reflection. So there wouldn't be a pollution as such. It would just be a waste. So there's a difference between waste and pollution. We're clear on that. So if that's only part of, if lighting shooting upwards is only part of the problem, then yes, we can tackle with it in many instances, and we should tackle with it. But we can look at the other part of the problem and solve a lot of the pollution issues, light pollution issues I'm talking about, based on the weather. So look at this image. I think this is Beijing city. 2 different days, daytime, and the sky luminance and the light levels you get and the pollution, visual light pollution in the sky, not necessarily talking about the particle pollution, is different. You can apply exactly the same thing to the nighttime. So we can now very, very precisely, very accurately measure meteorological conditions. We can predict them up to a couple of weeks in advance in certain cases, in certain cities. So why would we not tag the technology onto our lighting control devices for exterior lighting? So when we have highly humid or polluted or highly dense weather conditions that will create more light pollution, we can adjust our light levels, our exterior light levels, to lower levels to minimize the cause of light pollution in that way. And when it's perfectly clear sky, we can ramp them up. So you can have, and like this doesn't need any manual kind of interaction at all. It can all be automated. It can all be adjusted to communicate with some sort of station in a very simple but sophisticated way, where a certain signal dims the light up and down depending on the conditions of that particular day. So my dark sky slogan today is it's to adjust our lighting according to the weather. Which brings us to a scary type of light. Light phobia is something that exists. Have you ever thought there are actually people in the world who have a morbid fear of light? I'm not talking about vampires. Actually, there are people who, like, there are different types of light phobia. There are people who have heliophobia, that are scared of sunlight, very bright sunny conditions, photophobia, chromophobia, people who are scared of color, photic sneeze, some people get sneeze with certain conditions of light, photosensitive epilepsy, seasonally affective disorder, and so on and so on. So it's quite interesting to see. We have all sorts of accessibility guidelines in all sorts of aspects that address a lot of the needs of people who suffer different types of conditions, but not that much about lighting conditions when it comes to looking at our own profession and how we do not even, in a single tiniest project I've ever seen, any of these actually looked at in detail, except very, very specific hospital applications. Other than that, where you actually deal with these issues very specifically, and that isn't in large scales of hospital applications, very, very specific ones, you never see these things talked about. I'm running a little bit ahead of time, but yeah, maybe 5 to 10 minutes more, right? The dose of technical jargon. Let's hear this gentleman.
Such an instrument is the turboencabulator. Now, basically, the only new principle involved is that instead of power being generated by the relative motion of conductors and fluxes, it is produced by the modial interaction of magnetoreluctance and capacitive directance. The original machine had a base plate of prefamulated amulite surmounted by a malleable logarithmic casing in such a way that the two spurving bearings were in a direct line with a panometric fam. The latter consisted simply of 6 hydrocoptic Marsal vanes so fitted to the ambifacient lunar wane shaft that side fumbling was effectively prevented. The main winding was of the normal Lotus O delta type placed in panendermic semi-boloid slots of the stator, every 7th conductor being connected by a non-reversible Tremie pipe to the differential girdle spring on the up end of the Grammys. The turboencabulator has now reached a high level of development.
Anyway, jargon overload. So you can sort of guess where I'm going with this, but I'm not gonna go there. I'm going exactly the opposite way. I think we don't use enough technical jargon in our communications with our professionals and even with the public. And even when we use technical jargon, at least half of the time, we don't quite know what we are talking about, because the way, and this is definitely not a critique on lighting education here in particular in any way, but when you look at all over the world, the emphasis on technical jargon in lighting education is extremely low, I think. This is my personal experience of how I see lighting being taught to people, and how I see lighting designers, including myself, sometimes trying to explain certain things. You need to use technical jargon in a very authoritative but respectful manner at the same time, to be able to create a sense of confidence and trust with the parties that you deal with. So again, a proposition, something to think about, is that we are underutilizing the available technical jargon to us. We can use it at the right time, right place, right context, to our advantage, to make our unrecognized profession of lighting design recognized in a very, very different platform. I've got a couple more questions to go, if you excuse me. So, learning to see is a very interesting process. We learn to see. When we are born, we cannot see anything, or we see things, but we cannot make sense of things to an extent that we understand as adults. Or it's just adult minds trying to make sense of a baby's mind. But visual sensations, to our understanding, develop over time. We learn to see objects not only by seeing them, but by touching them, by smelling them, by hearing them, and so on. And through several different ways of interacting with objects in very, very different ways, we start forming these three-dimensional visions. Which brings us to recovery from blindness and agnosia. So if you were to learn to see at a later age in life, that is a very, very different experience. I've got a couple of case studies, but this is something that is heavily studied by William Molyneux, I think in French, that's how you say it. The sphere and the cube. He speculated that if a blind person developed vision, he would not at first connect his idea of a shape with the sight of a shape. The two would be very disconnected, and for a devastatingly long time, often. Let's look at two different scenarios. Sidney Bradford, these are actual medical case studies. Sidney Bradford, blind until age 52. In 1974, he gains sight through a surgery, and he has difficulty in appreciating perspective. Two-dimensional drawings, he can't even read, see, understand them. Difficulty in recognition of objects unless he actually senses them by touch. So if, there are experiments they made giving him a spoon, he doesn't know what it is until he actually touches and knows that it is a spoon. Michael May, blind between ages of 3 and 46, and in 2001 he gains sight again. He has no grasp of depth perception. People seem to shrink as they go. So in perspective, if he looks as someone walks away, the person basically gets smaller in his mind. So difficulty in recognizing facial impressions, difference between male or female facial issues. So it's very interesting how we take for granted how we learn to see, and how we are actually still learning to see every single moment of our life. We're learning to see, and our vision develops continuously, even if our visual systems decay day by day. And it's quite interesting to think about these things at a time when we are looking at technology taking grasp of our eyes ever more than it ever did. So we're approaching times where virtual reality, our visual reaction with virtual reality is becoming more and more dominant. And those of you who tested devices like this, it is incredible how a visual device can actually affect your entire body in very, very drastic ways. So we will need to learn to see in a very different way at a time in future when we interact with these sort of devices more than we do now. And I think this is the last one, if my memory is right. So from what light is not to what we don't or what we cannot see. Again, we learn seeing as time passes by. Our perception is mostly made up of our sensations of reality, not actual reality itself. We talked about that. Let's look at visual experience in a very simple way. What this poses is visual experience is not an attribute of the object, but it is rather guided and shaped by the present knowledge. So I'll show you a couple of quite well-known visual illusions. I'm sure a lot of you may have come across these before. If you were asked to read the colors of these boxes one by one, quite quickly, you'd be able to do it very easily. If you were asked the same question now to read out the colors of the words, you will be struggling a little bit more because of your present knowledge, because of your language skills. Because you know English, it would make you struggle. If you had no idea of the language, the task is quite similar, right? So our visual experience, our ways of dealing with visual experience is not an attribute of the context often. It is guided by our present knowledge. And let's look at this one. Visual experience is not an attribute of the object, and it depends on the context. We're looking at a picture. It has a certain visual context to it. It's a painting by Rob Gonzalez. He paints works of magical realism, as he names it. What I'm doing is I'm hiding part of the image here. And when I reveal that part of the image, you will see that it will completely change because the context will change. So what you see now is not a night sky of high-rise buildings, but someone cutting a curtain in a shape that resembles that. Let's look at this image as well. So visual experience, again, is guided by visual library of past experience. So different people may see different things in this image. If you show this image to your 3 or 4-year-old child, you would hope that he or she will see the 9 dolphins and nothing else other than the bottle and stuff. So some might struggle seeing the dolphins more than the others. Once I had a comment, someone shouting, "I can see only 7 dolphins." Okay. So just wrapping up slowly, looking at all these, understanding these issues of how visual experience can be bent in very different ways is an enormous tool for light and lighting design. We can, as designers, use these tools to hide what is out there or show things that do not actually exist. Again, very simple example. This is something that you can almost apply on any project that you're working on. Think of a surface at a certain color. And again, a very, very well-known visual illusion that you can apply different colors around it and you can actually change the perception of that very surface, the color of that surface, without actually having to do anything with that surface, without having to change anything of the lighting of that surface. And it shows, again, as professionals, the importance of our understanding of these issues within the teams, within the people that we work with. It is the real value we add to question light and use it in a very specific and very mindful way, technically as well as poetically in our work. And it is what will make lighting profession valid today and in the future. So I thank you for your attention. I'm very sorry for running out of time ahead of the, running too long and taking your time. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your night and this amazing work. There'll be plenty of time to work tomorrow. Enjoy. Thank you.